do want to get your thoughts on Angela Rayner talking about recognition of Palestine in just a few moments. But first up, let's talk about what has been happening in Rafah, because there's been this whole big battle. Like, Joe Biden basically saying to the Israelis, "You can't go into Rafah. You got to, can't have that big bombardment of Rafah. We're going to withdraw military aid if you do so." But the Israeli tanks are in the centre of Rafah. But we have seen also civilian deaths. Some denied by Israel, some admitted after they attacked not a refugee compound, but actually a military compound and Hamas fighters. But then there was an explosion and then tents caught fire nearby. Where are we with this? Where are we in terms of the willingness of Israel to continue this war, to go into Rafah? Is that basically ground invasion of Rafah? Is that going ahead? But everyone like Britain and America and everyone else is kind of pretending it's not a full ground invasion. What's going on the ground?
Well, as you say, Julia, there are 3 Israeli brigades operating in Gaza at the moment. They've sealed off the border with Egypt. They're going through the tunnels in the south, and you've got tanks in the middle of Rafah. The problem you've got is where they've cleared other areas in the north and centre, Hamas is re-infiltrating, and they're having to deal with those as well. As far as the Israelis are concerned, they need to be able to fulfill their political objectives, which is release the hostages, eradicate Hamas, and try and provide the basis for some sort of security in future. Nobody else has got a plan for that at the moment. So you've got to go with what the Israelis are doing. And who can blame them, to tell you the truth? I think the conflict's going to be over within 2 months. I don't think Hamas can hold out for much longer. Because as soon as they expose themselves above ground, they're getting hit. You mentioned the strike the other night, which took out the 2 Hamas officials who really coordinate operations in the West Bank. In fact, the munitions used were really quite tiny by aerial standards, but you got this obvious conflagration that occurred because there was a Hamas ammunition dump and fuel dump next to it.
But this is the thing here, isn't it? So, and I read the headlines, and even like quite articles in newspapers saying and websites saying, when Israel, Israeli forces, Israeli bombs hitting a refugee camp where people have been displaced from Rafah. They didn't. It was actually quite a way away. It was just these munitions, where they hit to strike a quite legitimate target, these Hamas leaders. There was a compound nearby that was full of military equipment, and this basically exploded. There were numerous secondary and third explosions, and that's what ended up meaning that that refugee tents caught fire. But there's no criticism ever, it appears, of Hamas for keeping military equipment and Hamas leadership close to what is supposed to be a safe civilian area. They didn't need to be there. They chose to be there because they thought it would mean that Israel wouldn't strike them.
Julia, I think all of us who are in the know that Hamas use the people of Gaza as weapons of war. And they sacrifice them without any conscience whatsoever. And we see their representatives lying. I mean, the first thing we heard from the so-called Palestinian ambassador to the UK, Mr. Zumlot, was that the Israelis had dropped 2,000-pound bombs on this target. Well, I'll tell you, having seen 2,000-pound bombs in reality, they would have produced craters greater than the size of the whole area. So that was a blatant lie for a start. And of course, then there's a media frenzy. Joe Biden hears about it, and we get all sorts of policy issues bearing in on it. But we've got to bear in mind that you've got to challenge anything Hamas says as a lie right from the start.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I do find it extraordinary. It's like people say, well, on the one hand, on the other hand. Again, not everything that's going to happen in this war is going to be acceptable on Israel's side. No doubt at all about it. And we should all be critical when that is the case. And mistakes happen and the like. But again, it is untrue to say that civilians were targeted. We can argue about whether or not it was proportionate, given who they were targeting, to take that risk, etc., etc. But again, this is what happens in war, and it's the sort of thing the British military have done, and the American military, and every other military in every war. In terms of where we are, in terms of the sort of diplomatic niceties, every man and his dog is talking about how we need a 2-state solution. The trouble is, we know that Netanyahu actually has spoken in the past that he doesn't believe a 2-state solution is viable. We know that the leaders of Palestinians, well, there is no offence, but there's no Lib Dem option There's no moderate option. Even the so-called moderates are not what most people in the West would think of as moderates. You've got Hamas, you've got Hezbollah, and all those. No, the reality, that's not an option. Hamas are very explicit. They don't believe in a two-state solution. When you have people who, I think many, for very good reasons, people don't want war. They don't want to see children dying. No one with any morality would want that. But do they simply just not understand what we are dealing with, which is basically a murderous death cult that wishes the end of not just Israel, but Jews in Israel, all Jews, and then the rest of us who are not Muslim?
Well, I think the Middle East is a very complex situation. That's a bit of a truism. But the fact of life is the two-state solution is not viable. If you are looking at, let's have a look at what Angela Rayner was proposing, that they would recognize Palestine. Well, if you had elections in so-called Palestine tomorrow, all the indications from Gaza and the West Bank is that 80% of adults would vote for Hamas.
And that's not just based on, was it 2005, 6 or something, when their last election was held?
Now.
But half of the people now weren't even old enough to vote then. But polling now has suggested that is what people think.
80% would vote for Hamas. And so if you have a hostile, as you say, death cult next door to you, are you going to tolerate that as a two-state solution? My own view, Julia, is that the best that the Palestinians can hope for, and I'm being a realist now, is a federated state with something like Jordan, where Jordan is big enough to be able to restrain some of these people and say, look, if you want to live peacefully and have a great economy, we'll federate with you and we'll keep peace with Israel.
Trouble is, the Jordanian leaders don't want this. Something like, isn't it 40–50% of the Jordanian population is Palestinian?
Palestinian.
My understanding is they're not keen on keeping them either, because they've had so many problems. There's a reason why people can't pass freely out of Gaza into Egypt, because they don't want them.
No, but you keep them in where they're living, but you federate it, if you like, as Gaza, West Bank, and Jordan. You don't actually keep people, but you actually make it a social economic entity, and you bring in international aid. You get things enforced. But
yeah, but when that aid is then turned into weaponry and more rockets are fired on Israel, what does Israel have to do at that point? Exactly what every other nation state would do. They fire back.
But the fact of life is, Julia, a two-state solution is just a fig leaf for politicians to talk about what the end state is. Well, it isn't an end state at all. We need to, what I was saying to some Palestinian people the other day, take Palestine off the agenda and put Palestinians on the table, and we might actually get towards a solution.
But when Angela Rayner said, and it's not official Labour Party policy, but the majority of countries in the world have recognised Palestine as a state. Norway, Spain, and Ireland just did that yesterday. But again, it doesn't fulfil a lot of the requirements of what a state is in terms of self-governance, in terms of borders, a clearly defined people, and the like. I mean, it doesn't have that. I mean, it's actually occupied, certainly in the West Bank, by Israel, and a lot of control of what happens in Gaza, obviously by Israel in terms of controlling their borders. So it is not in any meaningful sense a state anymore.
But it's not a state. If you look back, Julia, people in Gaza, for example, 50 years ago had Egyptian or Jordanian passports. They weren't Palestinians. This entity grew up in the 1960s as a way in which the KGB and the Russians could coerce the Americans in the Middle East. The whole entity has arisen out of that. And so you've got a false premise, as you say, and anything. If you recognise Palestine, you'll start saying, well, why not Catalonia? Why not Scotland? Why not all these other places?
Really interesting from Spain to actually, yes. But Basque territories, the Catalonia, yeah, indeed. There's a lot of very nice virtual things, especially by Ireland, who don't even bother having a sitting army because they just assume that we'll look after them in the event of anything happening. Yeah. Chris Parry, always such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us.